Hello, everyone. We appreciate you joining us today. We hope that you've had a good week and hope things are going well with you. We hope that this week is even a better week. We appreciate you joining us in our study. We've been studying on the end times, and today will be the third time in Matthew 24. It's kind of a difficult chapter to understand, Matthew 24. If you remember, I'll kind of review just a little bit, that the disciples were showing Jesus the buildings of the temple. It was a magnificent structure, and Jesus said something that really surprised them. He said, "You see these things?" He says, "I tell you that there will not be one stone left upon another that will not be thrown down." And a little bit later, when they had time, the disciples came to Jesus and they wanted to know when that would be and what would be the sign of his coming and the end of the age. Now, the last time we talked, I said in passing, I mentioned verse 15, which is a really difficult passage to cover, and I thought today we'd take a look at it a little closer. In fact, I thought we would read verses 15 and 16. And when I read this, I think you're going to go, yeah, I remember this verse. So here's what Jesus said. He says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." This passage is a warning. It's a forewarning from Jesus to the disciples. And there's several things in here, or just a few things in here that I wanted to bring out and mention, and one of them would be the phrase, the abomination of desolation. That's what Jesus said, and he said that was prophesied by Daniel. Now, what is the abomination of desolation? And I would just describe it as this. It's an outrageously profane desecration of the temple. Now, you remember that the temple was built at God's direction and his blueprints, and it was a place that he was worshipped. It was a holy place. In fact, the main building had two areas. It had the holy place and the Holy of Holies. And so Jesus is warning his disciples, and he's telling them, when you see this, that is the abomination of desolation, this when you see that the temple is being outrageously profane and desecrated, he said, then you need to flee. Those are in Judea. He says you need to flee to the mountains. And he also said this, he said, and let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house, and let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. And in fact, you need to just, when you see that, you need to leave. Now let me just mention that Daniel was a prophet 500 years before Jesus. And I want you to think about this a minute. So 500 years before Jesus, he made this prophecy, and this was in, I believe, in chapter 9, verse 27 of Daniel. Now the interesting thing is that 170 years before Jesus, there was a desecration of the temple on a really big scale. And that took place during the time of the Maccabees, and it took place by a person by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. Now he was a Greek, but he was also king of Syria, and he had captured Jerusalem and captured the temple, and he went into the temple, and what he did was he erected an altar to his god, to Zeus. Imagine that. And that's not all he did. Another thing that he did was he sacrificed swine in the temple. Also, he turned the priest room and the temple chambers into brothels, into public brothels. And so this was all, I read all of this in my commentary on Matthew by William Barclay. So 170 years before Jesus, the temple was desecrated. But here we're reading that Jesus is predicting that there's going to come another time when there will be an abomination of desolation. In fact, he's warning his disciples, when you see this. So 40 years after Jesus, again the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed and sacked. And this time it was done by the Romans, by the general Titus. And he went in there and took the Roman ensigns, these banners and things that they carried and that represented their gods. He took them into the temple and he made sacrifices in the temple. In fact, he destroyed the whole temple. But as I've mentioned before, that there are people, and I think I need to mention this just so that we will have an understanding that there are people that interpret Daniel's prophecy and Jesus' prophecy as an event that is yet to happen. And that kind of brings interest and intrigue because for that to happen, there's going to have to be another temple built. And so they interpret that what Jesus is saying and what Daniel is saying is something that is yet to happen. And it will happen by a person that is known as the Antichrist. Perhaps you have heard of that phrase. The Antichrist himself will go into the temple. And I wanted to read something to you that Paul said over in Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians. Listen to this. He says, "Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed." Now, we usually interpret that as the Antichrist. So the man of sin is revealed, and he's called the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God, or that is worshiped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Now, people believe that that's going to happen. And in order for it to happen, there will have to be another temple that'll be built. And when that happens, that abomination of desecration will take place. And it'll be the key sign for Jesus' coming. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing. And it's really, I think it's important for us to study history. We need to study the history of our country. I think that if we had, if people had a better knowledge of our history of our country and the sacrifices that people have made and all that took place in order for us to enjoy the things that we enjoy, maybe they'd have a little bit different perspective on appreciating our country. But my point is this, that we need to study biblical history too, because it helps us to understand how to interpret Scripture and what things mean. Now, I'm going to close, but I want to mention one other thing to you, that the verses that really make me not rule out completely the possibility of a third temple and its destruction are these verses. And so this verse is in Matthew 24, 21, and 22. And let me read this to you. So Jesus said this. He says, "For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world, and until this time, no, nor ever shall be." And so that makes me pause and makes me wonder. Now, I know that the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Romans was a horrific event. And there was great tribulation during that period. Over 1 million people were killed, and they had to walk over the corpses. So it was a tremendous thing. But my wonder is this: is that or was that the worst tribulation that has ever been in the world or ever will be? Because Jesus says this, he says, "For them there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened." And so that makes me wonder when I'm reading these passages, especially about the abomination of desolation, was Jesus referring to something that was going to happen 40 years, or was he talking about something that would happen yet in the future? And I know some people think that they know and understand, but for me, it's just kind of a head scratcher for me. But listen, we appreciate you joining us, and we don't have a lot of time on these videos to go going more. And then next week we'll talk a little bit more about some more verses. We're kind of working our way through Matthew 24. So thanks again for joining us. I hope you have a good week.